This week's gospel lesson from Matthew drops us right into the middle of an extended discourse by Jesus. He is speaking to the crowds who are following him. And when we first come upon him, he is teaching from a boat, the crowd listening on the shore. The scene then shifts, and he is alone with his disciples, taking their questions as they try and figure out just what it is he is saying. Jesus has been teaching in parables, those short, enigmatic sayings. Today, we hear Jesus' teaching on what the kingdom of heaven is like. He gives many disparate examples. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed. It is like yeast mixed into flour. It is like a treasure hidden in a field, a net thrown into the sea. The kingdom of heaven is one precious pearl of immense value. Amy Jill Levine, a professor of New Testament and Jewish studies at Vanderbilt University, has written a book about the parables of Jesus called Short Stories by Jesus. She describes parables as open narratives that invite us into engagement with them. Parables in and of themselves contain a surplus of meaning, and as such, they are closely akin to poetry and storytelling. No matter the poem or story, over our lifetimes, we hear things differently as our circumstances change. Last fall, the Wednesday morning Bible study group spent many weeks studying, dissecting, and discussing the parables of Jesus. And yet, in encountering today's parables all these months later, I find I am hearing new things, and my brain is obsessing over and pulling at different strands in the text. For instance, I must confess, I have always glossed over the parable of the yeast. It comes right after the parable of the mustard seed, and my eyes and ears just kind of skip it. That, and it's very short. It reads like this. He told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed in 3 measures of flour until all of it was leavened. That's it. If I've thought of it at all, I've usually lumped it in with the parable of the mustard seed, 2 stories of tiny things that grow and transform into something large, something seemingly divorced from their origins. That it is the smallness of the seed and of that bit of yeast that is the point of the story. But again, as Amy Jill Levine suggests, the parables cause us to reevaluate the meanest of domestic materials. Do you remember how at the beginning of this pandemic, it seemed as if suddenly everyone was baking? I've always taken yeast and flour for granted, absolutely. It never would have occurred to me to think of these things as precious commodities in my well-fed world. And then, suddenly, you couldn't find flour or yeast anywhere. Yeast, especially. It became this unattainable commodity. The absence of yeast in this world, at least for a time, has made me pay attention to this small and perhaps ignoble little parable. The absence of yeast and the sudden desire for it made me wonder about its inclusion in the Gospels as one of the parables of Jesus. In digging a bit deeper, I learned that in antiquity, yeast or leaven, as it is also called, was what today we would call sourdough starter. And when I read this, the parable came alive for me. It's not just about yeast in a packet you rip open and sprinkle into flour and water, but rather it is about yeast as leaven, as sourdough starter that has been carefully tended and fed over days and weeks, even years. The kingdom of heaven is like sourdough starter. as so many people baked their way through March and April, and as flour and yeast disappeared from grocery store shelves, pictures of sourdough starter began popping up on various social media platforms. With a little more time, and within the enforced confines of home, these newly minted bakers were returning to more ancient practices, taking the time to feed and maintain their starters. Depending on how often you bake, this leaven must be fed once a week or even twice a day. For as one website suggested, it takes some time until it is strong enough to leaven bread. Perhaps this is what Jesus is describing in the parable. The kingdom of heaven is like this leaven. It is mixed into the flour, but it must first be tended in order to be of any use. And I might be leaping into thin air here, but now I'm thinking of us as the flour in this parable, and as the yeast or leaven, as the kingdom of heaven, which is mixed into us and resides within us. The leaven as our soul, the place of God within us, and whose growth is dependent on our care and feeding of it. Which leads me again to wonder, as I have been wondering all summer long, about the state of our souls, the state of our inner lives. I've been wondering how we are doing during this time of extended stress and strain. I've been wondering because I have certainly been falling short. I've been wondering if we have remembered to feed our souls as consistently as we feed that constant pull to action. Given the fraught nature of our lives and the uncertain state of our world, it would be logical to assume that our souls need more feeding, not less. But my suspicion, using myself as patient zero, is that we have not been tending to the care of our souls, which means we might be very close to running on empty. And that is not something we can afford. Our fermenting, yeasty souls need care. They need tending. They need feeding. It is not, in fact, a luxury to apprise ourselves of quiet, of space, of prayer. Our souls must be fed in order for us to continue the good work we are attempting to do in a time of profound stress. It seems counterintuitive to take some moments, even just a few moments, 5 or 10 minutes, and just stop. Stop moving. Stop planning. Stop scrolling. Stop obsessing over the unknown. And please know I am speaking as much to myself as I am to you. If the kingdom of heaven is the leaven of our souls, it requires our attention in order for us to do the transformative work, the work of justice and mercy and kindness that we are being called to do. As counterintuitive as it seems, we need to tend the kingdom of God within in order to attend to the kingdom of God without. This week, you and I, let's take a few moments to tend the sourdough starters of our souls and feed our souls with some quiet, some space, some prayer. just for a few moments, stop. Be still. Know that God is God.